Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Carrie Burke, your moderator for today's webinar, Security Champions, Pushing Security Expertise to the Edge of Your Organization. You may send in questions at any time during the presentation via the chat feature. We will collect these and address them at the end of today's presentation. I would now like to introduce Denim Group Principal John Dixon, who will give a background on our speaker today.
All right, thanks, Carrie. I appreciate it. Glad to have everybody on today. Welcome interruption from the work from home Zoom Zoom conferences. As you're probably aware, I mean, application security is an interesting and quite challenging effort within many enterprises. What we have to do is to get others to do on our behalf, the developers, what they may or may not be doing already. And part of that way you do that is via an emerging set of practices around security champions. The interesting thing is much of what we hear in the field and what we hear from other clients and from other vendors is a emerging set of best practices. And that's what Dan Cornell is going to cover today. I have the honor of introducing my business partner and fellow Denim Group principal, Dan Cornell. Many of you know Dan, and Dan is so well known within at least the OWASP and AppSec circles that he doesn't need a last name. It's Dan. And for those that don't know Dan, he is a CTO and founder of Denim Group. He's also the author of Threadfix. He has been both a hardcore Java developer, an architect, an AppSec person, and has the resume and CV to reflect all that. But what I know about Dan is that he has a rare combination of being both a super technical person that can explain things in layman's terms and has quite a business acumen about him, which is unusual for certain techies, I should say. Again, he's got this background. He also holds multiple patents around Threadfix, around hybrid analysis mapping, and is on the speaker circuit throughout. So if you don't recognize Dan, you also get the reward of seeing him with his COVID-19 home haircut that just happened, apparently. So you've got that added value today. And with that, I would like to introduce Dan, and it's all yours, sir. Good luck.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Carrie. Thank all of you for taking time today out of your schedule of busy Zoom meetings to go to another Zoom meeting to sit with us and talk today. And what I'm going to be talking about today is, as John said, in the scheme of things, relatively recent evolution that we've seen in a lot of organizations, application security programs called security champions. And that's embedding or overlaying security expertise on development teams. And I really view that as trying to push security out to the edges of your organization. As we'll talk about, a lot of software security programs have evolved to be pretty centralized, which makes sense because they can set standards and manage large tool rollouts and things like that. There's a lot of value in centralization, but as we'll see, there's also value in pushing some of this expertise out and getting it closer to the developers where this security knowledge can be more immediately useful. Just a little bit of background about me. That's a picture of me with a slightly more professional haircut and nice clothes. But as John said, I'm one of the founders and the CTO of Denim Group, and I'm a software developer by background. I spent the mid to late 90s doing a lot of early server-side Java stuff. And the early 2000s doing some work with early .NET. But really for the last 15 years or so, I've been working with organizations, helping them deal with the risk associated with the software that they're developing and deploying. I'm one of the co-leaders of the OWASP San Antonio chapter. And again, I've been in this industry in software in general and software security specifically for quite a while now. As John mentioned, I got to the point where I finally needed a haircut, and so I enlisted the aid of a buddy of mine who well, when gyms were still open, I used to lift weights with. He is a stylist, and offered to help my wife out by showing her how to cut hair. So it was we had a fun little time doing that. I don't know if he's ready to give her a seat in his salon, or if he's ready to give my wife a seat in his salon to start cutting hair professionally. But at least I was able to get myself cleaned up a little bit, which is good. Just a little background about Denim Group. So agenda-wise, I want to provide some background of what we've seen of the evolution of security assurance programs, or software security assurance programs. What we've seen over time in our engagements at Denim Group, with our advisory services, with our testing services, helping organizations, stand up and evolve their software security and application security programs. And then looking specifically at security champions programs, I'll talk through the major steps that we see organizations go through as they try to stand up software security programs, and relay some of the things we've seen that have worked, some of the things that haven't worked, patterns that might work in one organization but might not work in another. As we get toward the end, I'll point out some additional resources that people can go look for, and then we'll have some time at the end for questions. And so please use the Zoom chat and whatnot, and the Q&A feature to submit those, and we'll address those toward the end. So looking at the evolution of software security assurance programs over time, as I've mentioned, I've had the distinct honor, the pleasure of being in this space for over 15 years at this point. So I have a little bit of the benefit and some of the curse of perspective, and having watched our engagements evolve over time. And so, when we first started doing work with organizations on application security, really all the engagements were about random pen tests. When we looked at, whatever you might call an application security program in an organization, the scope of that program was really, the apps that everybody knew about that were really, really important, really high value, maybe required to be tested by compliance. But it was a real barbarians at the gate type of a feel. The frequency was very ad hoc. In a lot of cases, hey, a customer told us to do this, we've got to do it, or maybe an annual pen test or even a quarterly pen test. And a real challenge at this stage for a lot of organizations is the teams were staffed by someone where it was additional duty for someone who was doing their network scanning and testing. And so we were interacting with teams that didn't necessarily have a lot of application or application development or software development knowledge. They weren't familiar with IDEs, unit testing, Scrum, and Agile. And I think back to John Dixon, and in this period would give talks at ISSA meetings and say, well, who here has done software development, has done software development? And a bunch of hands in those meetings would go up, and he'd say, well, who has done software development in something other than Fortran or COBOL, right? And the hands would go down. And so a real challenge that these programs had at the time is, again, they were not terribly well funded, they were ad hoc. But the people in the programs, running the programs, didn't know a lot about applications and software development. And so that makes it really challenging to go and talk to software developers and to get them, as John said in the introduction, to get them to do things on your behalf. Fortunately, as perception of the risk increased, as the approach that organizations were taking to this evolved, what we saw and what others, I remember reading the early versions of the BSIM, talking about the Central Software Security Group, a central dedicated group that was responsible for application and software security in an organization. With this, the scope of the programs became more comprehensive, started getting better portfolios of applications, along with collecting some metadata and doing risk ranking. Again, organizations are still at varied levels of maturity in this now, but when we're looking at the leading organizations, they got a lot more formal, and the testing frequency was much more regular and targeted by risk. And this is also when we started to see organizations staffed by dedicated software security professionals. Originally, that was often one person. Here is our AppSec person. But really, in the past years, we've seen that evolve as the discipline has grown more mature and we've seen specialization. Here is our static testing person or team, our dynamic testing person or team. This is something that I see a lot with the when I work with organizations talking about Threadfix. They'll be in different representatives. Here's the static testing people, here's the dynamic testing people, here's the threat modeling people. And so we've seen these groups evolve, and in a lot of cases they were the central, in a lot of cases a central gate for major releases of high risk applications, depending on that organization and how much power that the particular central group had. And what we've seen in the past probably 2 to 3 years really become much more mainstream is the augmenting of the central software security group with security champions. And again, the scope of these programs tends to be comprehensive. They're risk ranking applications, collecting metadata, still doing the testing that they were doing before. Now maybe they're incorporating some testing into CI/CD pipelines. And again, we see they're still staffed by these existing central software security group team members, but they're augmenting that capability either with security champions that are drawn from the development teams, or security champions that they're hiring specifically into that role. And one of the things that we'll talk about is the choice between, do I want to promote people up from the ranks in the development teams, or do I want to hire specifically for these roles? And we'll talk about different trade-offs or choices you might make that would lead you to one or the other. And we'll also talk about how the security champions aren't going to replace the software security group, right? They enhance it and help it scale more effectively. For the purposes of this discussion, what do we consider security champions to be? And I'm going to really look at it's the very broad concept of embedding or attaching security expertise specifically to development teams. There are a lot of ways that we've seen organizations approach this. We've seen approaches that are successful, approaches that are less successful, and hopefully we've teased out some of the characteristics that make some more successful than others that we'll talk about. But really what you're looking for is you want someone to be the voice of security that is close to the developers. You want that the developers can go and ask security questions to. And again, we'll talk about different patterns and success factors that we've seen along the way. But for the purposes of this discussion, I want to take a very broad view of security champions, of how do we embed or attach security expertise to development teams. So looking at program development, if we genericize what we've done in our work with organizations where we've helped them stand up security champion programs, the pattern roughly looks like this. You start out with a mandate. What is it that you want your security champions program to do? And then look at, once we know what we're going to do, what are the roles that we need? What do those look like? And what are the standards and the resources that those teams are going to have? From there, you launch, you get the initial program up and running, and then you look to optimize over time. And that's one of the things that we've seen is you want to be very thoughtful and planful, and we'll talk about the value of that. But you don't want to, pick your, boil the ocean, whatever your metaphor is for, biting off more than you can chew, trying to do too much. This is definitely something where you want to show wins early on and evolve over time as you see what's working and what's not working. So looking at the mandate, the mandate for your program is really the foundation of everything that comes after. And it's you have to answer the question of what do you want your security champions program to do, and what do you want it not to do? There are a lot of aspects and activities that go into an application security program, and it's very important to be specific about what you're expecting to accomplish. The mandate's the foundation for whatever comes after, and security champions programs aren't a way to push responsibility off to the dev teams and just call the problem solved. It's not a way to sprinkle magic security fairy dust around the organization, and it's not a magic way to get to scale your testing and threat modeling programs without adding any new resources. So those are important things to understand going into a program. Two great resources, just looking at a program design and determining what do I want to have in my Security Champions program, what do I want them to be responsible for, and what do I not want them to be responsible for, is the building security and maturity model, as well as the BSIM and OWASP software assurance maturity model, or OWASP SAM. So I just wanted to provide links to those resources. These are great, have great information broadly about application security programs and the activities that go into them, as well as some more specific information about the Security Champions programs. And so if we look at example models or mandates that we've seen other organizations go through, we worked with a media company and it had a lot of focus on remediation. They had looked around, so we've got all these vulnerabilities. How do we get the dev teams to address more of these vulnerabilities faster? And so their initial efforts at the Security Champions program was very focused on the remediation workflow, the adjudication of false positives, and making sure that serious vulnerabilities were driven through to resolution. Another large bank we worked with wanted to get more testing and threat modeling done to scale those programs out across the organization. Another group that we worked with was very focused on how do we train the trainer and push out training for developers on security. How do we get knowledge really close to these developers so that they've got resources to work with? And we've also worked with a number of organizations that are really focused on how do I get security testing into CI/CD pipelines. There are a lot of ways to look at your Security Champions program. But the critical thing is to understand that if everything is important, then nothing is important. And that's something that I've been saying a lot in a variety of contexts recently. That's just the reality. And if you look at the scale of the problem of application security, you've got to be really explicit about your goals. And if you are, then you have a much better chance to achieve them. It's also important from a planning standpoint when you look at your mandate. The tasks for the Security Champions have to be accomplished by people that are working 40-something hours per week or some reasonable number of hours per week. Right? These activities aren't free. The question is more about, am I putting the knowledge and am I putting this activity at the appropriate part of our org structure or in the appropriate part of our organization so they can be done most effectively and most efficiently. So those are the types of questions that you need to, that are important to consider. And again, from this mandate of what are we looking to accomplish with our Security Champions, the decisions that you make after that flow from there. So now that you know what you want to do, right? I want to, get more people trained on security. I want to extend our testing, whatever that might be. Now we can determine the roles of the people that are going to accomplish these things, and you can start to put together the standards, or I've also called this like doctrine. What are the resources and the standards that we have that those individuals are going to use? For roles, this can't be an informal program in our experience, because nobody takes it seriously for long. It's got to be something where people, understand that they have a job to do, they have responsibilities, they're being given the resources and the training so that they have the capabilities. If you want this, if you want this to continue, again, as we'll talk about, certain developers are really interested in security. They take it as a hobby thing or something for them from a professional development standpoint, and that's great. We're talking about trying to put a structured program in place, and again, we can't expect people to do this for free. The Security Champions tasks are going to have to take time, so you have to plan and budget for that. That has to be part of the structure of what you're doing in your program. I've really found it also is important for these to be seen as legitimate career paths in your organization, where people see, there's a progression that I can take, and this is going to give me professional fulfillment. It's going to, I'm going to be open up for promotions. There's going to be compensation changes. That all those help to go in, that create the incentive structure that you need for people to take these programs seriously, and obviously then put you in a better situation to accomplish your goals. Here's some example roles and capabilities from an organization. And in this organization, they had set this up where it was a progression. So you had these kind of low-level Security Champion trainees where they were just given some baseline training and knowledge, and were early stage and able to accomplish certain low-level tasks. Then you had the more formal security champions, where they were focused on dealing with scan results and remediation. And then you saw that career path transition, actually moving them into the central software security group as an analyst, and then as an engineer, and then ultimately as an architect. And so you see that in this security champions program, they were drawing from the dev teams, but ultimately bringing people into the software security group. Now, in certain organizations, this would be politically untenable, right? You'd be seen as the security team preying on the dev team. It's hard to find security people, but it's also hard to find developers. And so the dev team's obviously not going to be happy to have the security folk coming in and preying on their people. But in large organizations that we've worked with, there is, especially where employees tend to have longer tenures, there's a better expectation that organizations are that people are going to move around the organization, that as part of their career, they're going to need to work in multiple areas, because that opens them up for progression through that organization. So this is an example of looking at the roles and the progression. You may look and say, we are an organization where this is a tenable thing to do. This is politically acceptable. Or you may look at this and say, like, no, this is something, if we're going to go to the dev teams and mess with their people, we have to find a way to assure that we're not going to, assure them that we're not going to systematically take away their people. Here's also looking at some capabilities and levels, right? And so what we did in this case is we broke out what are the different disciplines that you need people in your program to have, and at what level of at what level of their progression do you expect them to have certain capabilities? And so this is broken up into different classes. We're doing application assessments, and that could be code reviews, penetration testing. As contrasted with architecture and things of that nature. And this is similar to the way that we do some of our talent management at Denim Group, where we have consultants at different levels, and they're expected to have certain sets of skills. And that's something that we have found, just from a general HR practice standpoint, is helpful, because it sets up it takes out some of the emotion or the subjectivity when people are looking for progression. Someone says, well, I want a raise and a promotion. You can say, well, I need you to, per the definition, you need to be performing at this level and you need to have these skills. Do you have them? Yes. Okay, good. Then your promotion may make sense at this point. We don't think a promotion makes sense at this point. Here are the specific areas we would like for you to work on, and let's revisit this in some period of time. And so being able to provide a structure for your security champions so that they understand what is expected of them provides tremendous value, because again, it takes what is often a subjective thing and turns it into an objective thing that sets you up for a much more structured set of conversations. When I was talking with one of our senior folks just rolling off an engagement doing helping build the Security Champions program, he was really emphatic. He said that the key is enablement. We need to give the security champions the resources they need to be successful, right? And so it's a question of how can we standardize this to the degree possible so that they have the terminology, they've got access to the knowledge base, and they are given the training they need so that they have all the capabilities they need to be successful. And these can mean different things, right? You want to have a standard language about vulnerability severity. I'm a big fan of Dread. The world has kind of moved on from that. That's fine. So you got CVSS, other standards. When we look at vulnerabilities, how can we communicate in a less ambiguous way about the risk associated with them? Right, that's an important thing in your program to understand. Also, understanding the scanning and testing workflows. Who is responsible for doing certain activities at different points in time? And then vulnerability remediation workflows. When we find vulnerabilities, how do we triage those, determine which we're concerned about, which we're less concerned about, and for the ones we're concerned about, how do we work those through the resolution process, right? These are the things that these are the types of things that you're going to want your security champions to be doing. And so they need to be standardized so that they understand the process that they need to work through. Similar secure coding guidelines. I like to focus on checklists and lightweight materials. I've never seen more ignorable documents in a lot of cases than like heavyweight secure coding standards. For all the good intentions that have gone into crafting those documents, that just doesn't mesh with the way that developers consume information. I like the OWASP cheat sheets project. They take a much more lightweight, kind of brief subject matter explanations. We've used those in a lot of cases. As with all free materials that you're getting, you need to vet, make sure that they are that the materials you're using are up to date and applicable. But those are a great starting point. And you also need to have your training curriculum. Again, when you know what topics, when you know what topics you want people to know about, then you can make sure that you have training available to do that. And we'll talk about some of the different options for training in just a little bit. But again, these are the things that you want to lay out so that you can go to the security champions and say, here are the resources that we're making available to you so that you can be more effective with with the job that we're asking you to do. So once you have a mandate, once you have your roles defined and you have your standards that you're going to use to enable those people, you've got to build the team and begin the rollout. And so, for the team process, you need to recruit the individuals that are going to be on the team. You need to train them, and then over time, they're going to need growth. Again, that's something that comes up again and again. Is when we look at these security champions, this can't be a dead-end thing. There has to be a career progression where you expect these people to get better over time. And that's especially key if you want to retain talent. And that's another thing that we'll talk about is some of the risks associated with training folks up. And really, we've seen two major approaches that organizations have used in standing up their security champions program. One is selecting and training from within the development teams, and the other is bringing in new team members with security-specific duties. So if we look at the selecting and training from your development teams, they've got the home field advantage. They're familiar with the team, the tools, the processes. They know the IDEs, the CI/CD pipeline. They're up to speed on that, which is incredibly valuable because you want them to be the voice of security for that team. A challenge is that they typically have limited security knowledge at the outset. And so that means that it's going to require training, resources to train them, and it's going to take time for them to get trained up. So that's a challenge. And a lot of times in these cases, security is an additional duty on top of their development tasks. And so if you're doing your Scrum, your sprint planning, some story points are going to be allocated to these security tasks, and those are not going to be available to allocate to other development tasks, depending on what level of resources you're attaching to this. But that is something that you're going to have to understand is, if you've got a team of 5 developers or 10 developers, and you task one of them half time with being the security champion, you've lost some percentage of your development capacity. And again, that's not a bad thing, but it's something that needs to be planned for. So how do you identify the developers that you want to elevate or to put on this career track for security champions? Obviously, some people may volunteer. There may be students or individuals that have a certain aptitude or interest identified. I had a perception for a long time that all developers needed to, become some level of security expert. And I've since decided that's not the case. I think everybody obviously needs a base level of security knowledge, but I think it's important to recognize that not every developer wants to or has the aptitude to adopt that kind of adversarial security mindset. But some do. We run a lot of training classes. I individually run a lot of secure coding classes, and it's one of the challenging things about it is that people come to those classes with a different level of knowledge, different level of aptitude and interest. And so you've got to deal with classes where there's a variability in the level of knowledge. And just as an instructor, it's hard to kind of keep everybody moving at roughly the same pace. But that's also an opportunity as an instructor to identify, hey, here are the people that really get this. These are the people that are always done with the exercise first, or they're on to the next exercise. If you're looking at recruiting, that's a great way to identify people who would be good to select to be security champions. pay attention to those folks, because they're letting you know either explicitly or at least implicitly that they likely have what it takes in order to do this. If we look at the approach of bringing in new, they're going to have to become familiar with the teams and their tools and their processes because they're coming in from the outside. And so that puts them at a bit of a disadvantage for the type of very specific mentoring and knowledge transfer that you're likely looking for. The good news is you can hire for specific skills. If you want somebody that knows, threat modeling and Fortify SCA, you can find people that have those explicit skills. You can hire for them rather than being required to train those people up. And so these are folks that for certain activities can be a little bit more instant impact. What we've seen for people bringing in new folks, security is typically their duty, right? They're not intended to add directly to the dev capacity or to add building features and things of that nature as part-time security champions might be, and they may act as the security overlay for multiple teams, where they would have multiple teams that they're assigned to provide that knowledge. So with this, you run into the general problem that we have in security and specifically in application security, which is these people are often hard to find and they're expensive to hire and keep. And so that is one advantage and something that we did at Denim Group early on in building out our practices. We took developers that we're working with us and we trained them on security and transitioned them as a career path inside of Denim Group. One thing to be aware of and to anticipate is, with the value placed on security knowledge, as you train, if you're training up your developers on security, you're making them more valuable in the marketplace. And you should anticipate that there's going to be, from a compensation standpoint, that there are going to be impacts of that. And we've seen pushback in certain organizations about that, and it makes me think of the old adage of, on the one hand, what if we train all our people and they leave? Right? Well, the flip of that is like, what if you don't train your people and they stay, right? And so, again, a lot of these security champion questions about security champions programs will bring you back to asking questions about like how your organization attracts and retains talent. And so, I don't have the magic answer for you, but it's certainly a question that you should anticipate asking. So which of these approaches is better? Unsurprisingly, the answer to that is it depends. And this is where you go back to your mandate and roles, right? If you want to accelerate the vulnerability remediation process, selecting and training folks, that may be more appropriate because they're going to be, with some knowledge of remediation, they can be pretty quickly useful, and they know, hey, here's where we do our sprint planning. Here's where the different tasks get assigned. Let's bundle these vulnerabilities up at defects, work those through the process, that we can verify some of this in the CI/CD pipeline, right? They already know how the team works, and so to get the team to work faster at certain bug fixes, they're going to be in a good situation for that. But if you're looking at these security champions to scale and provide better throughput to your testing and threat modeling, in that case, bringing in new folks might be appropriate because they're not going to need as much of the specific team knowledge of their tool sets and things of that nature, but you're going to want them to have skills in testing and threat modeling, which take time through your career to develop. And so this is why having a strong mandate puts you in a much better situation to be successful later on, because you have a framework for making decisions. So training security champions, you want to have certain skill levels. You can look back to the standards and doctrine that you laid out. It's amusing looking at this. What are your options? You can do instructor-led training. That industry is probably in a somewhat rough shape for at least a little while because of the current situation. You can do e-learning, and there's kind of the big monolithic e-learning. We're seeing a lot more use of the kind of smaller snippet-based e-learning, which I think is really exciting. And you can have people do self-study. So there are options for that. Although again, I think we're going to see a lot more remote or virtual Zoom-led learning for at least a little while until the world gets a little bit more back to normal. So as we've talked about this career growth, these security champion roles we really see that these need to be viewed as a viable career path. And again, this lets you go back and refer to those skills and capability levels. As you grow these people over time, you can set goals to say, hey, you've done a lot of web testing. Before we move you up to like an engineer and architect role, you also need to get proficient in mobile or IoT testing. Here's our matrix of the skills that we want and we expect you to have at different levels. And so you have a framework to grow these people over time. How do people in the security industry gain this type of information? Conferences, in-person conferences, very popular, very popular. Not popular at this instant, but we're seeing a lot more, conferences go online and things of that nature. And also, again, kind of the standard security practices of doing vulnerability research and to work on different skills and get different insight. And this is also an area where we feel like there are important soft skills, that leadership training or management training as people move along that you certainly want to pay attention to. If you look at the developing security talent, it's not just about dropping exploits and hacking into stuff. People also need to be able to communicate effectively. They need to be able to win friends and influence people. And so that's something that is often overlooked. That I feel like at least is something that should be explicitly included where possible. And you need to do periodic reviews. Are you achieving your desired outcome? You wanted to get your remediation times down and you're using the Security Champions program to do that. Great. Have your remediation times gone down? You've got to be able to run metrics and understand that, and answer the question of what has it cost, and is that the best use of our resources? It's periodically something that we do, is ask the question, what are we doing that we should keep doing? What are we doing that we should stop doing? And what are ideas for things that we should start doing? In looking at the effectiveness of your security champions, it helps if you have the ability to measure and get metrics and report on what you're doing in your program. Obviously, Threadfix is my preferred way that organizations do that. But independent of that specific solution, that's important for you to be able to answer those questions. Like, how are we tracking metrics in our program? And can we make a justification to say, for these resources that we invested, we got the desired security outcome that we were looking for? So just some thoughts here. People like the idea of security champions programs. What is Stephen Colbert? They feel truthy, right? Whereas you hear that, you're like, yeah, that just feels like it's true. I don't have any evidence that it's true, but it feels like it's true, and so I like that. And I think that idea of hey, there's certain things that we should do centrally, but also we want to get developers more involved in security. That is in line with what people want to believe. And so I think there's a lot of affinity for security champions programs. The flip side of that, is that they, often are just a little bit harder than you want them to be, and they cost a little bit more than you expect them to. But that's why we've found it's important to be to plan for this and to really understand what your expectations are, because what we've seen, if they're managed well, is they can provide the speed and the scale for certain activities that you're really looking for. We've seen organizations do incredible things with security champions programs. It just requires this to be done in a planful and thoughtful way. It isn't just free security expertise and effort. And really, in organizations that are adopting or moving to a DevOps culture, DevSecOps, with security champions is really becoming the norm. Where as you expect people to break down silos between these groups and cross-train people, having certain individuals that are cross-trained in security, is very much becoming the norm. So if we look at success factors, the first thing, and I can't stress this enough, is have a solid mandate. What do you want to get out of your program? And let's be realistic of what to expect as you start. But have a solid mandate. Know what you want. It gives you a much better chance to actually get what you want. And you want to make sure to allocate sufficient resources, whether that's, again, allocating for time from individual developers on teams, or whether that is allocating additional headcount for these overlays. Make sure that you've allocated these resources, because otherwise this is going to have a negative impact. Well, either the security task won't get done, or it's going to have an unacceptable negative impact in other areas of the business. It's not going to make your security champions program terribly popular. And really focus on enablement. Make sure that these folks have the ability to reach back to the software security group so that they've got the standards, they've got the materials, they've got the training that they need, right? You want to focus on, you want these people to go out and do what their teams need for them to do to accomplish your security goals. Make sure you're giving them the resources they need to be successful. And really start small and evolve. This doesn't need to be a monolithic thing where you solve all of your organizations or all the world's problems. It's something where you can try to say, well, hey, let's see if we can use security champions to get remediation times now. Great. Let's see if we can extend that so now we're getting testing in a CI/CD pipeline so that we're finding stuff faster. Great. And work from there. So those are the things that we've found with the organizations that have had the most success rolling out these programs. I wanted to point y'all at a couple of additional resources that are out there that can also be valuable. I mentioned already the BSIM and OpenSAM. Great information in both of those resources. There's also the Security Champions Playbook. That is a link to the content on GitHub. There are a bunch of links to the OWASP site. That seems like the OWASP site redesign has kind of like broken some links and things like that. But you can go to the Security Champions Playbook and see some things, some additional information or thoughts there. He doesn't know that I'm mentioning this, but Dennis Cruz, he's the SVP of Engineering and CISO at Glasswall, also a longtime OWASP contributor, former OWASP board member, and he had a recent Twitter thread on their security champions program that they're rolling out at Glasswall. Dennis Cruz is a true madman, and I always love to hear his opinion, his thoughts on pretty much any topic. I don't always agree with him, but he is always worth listening to. So I wanted to point you at that as well. And now open this up for some questions. Let me see what we've got here. Let's see. A couple questions here about if we're sharing the presentation. Yeah, we'll be sharing the presentation and the recording of that afterward here shortly. Okay, a question: is it better to teach security to a developer or teach development to InfoSec professionals? So what we've always found is that it is much more practical to teach security to developers than it is to teach more traditional security folks about development. And here's the reason. I think back to my background. I think back to my background as a software developer, right? And I was one of the kids who was fortunate enough to have a computer growing up, and so I was writing programs in BASIC, all through school, up through high school, and rolled into college, where I spent 4 years getting a computer science degree, which had certain obviously like research and theory aspects to it, but also in a large way was vocational training to be a professional programmer, right? So I when I came out in the world as a developer, I had a lot of time behind me learning about development and debugging and all these other topics. And that just took a lot of time. And to focus me on security then is comparatively easy to communicate to me topics, or for me at least, it was, here's authentication, here's authorization, here's the concept of input validation. In a lot of cases, I think it's a lot easier to turn a developer into a security professional as opposed to someone who has like a policy background or a pen testing background, and where they weren't doing any coding, and say, oh, well, here's an integrated development environment, and here's how Scrum works, and all those things. So that's something that I've found personally for myself, and also in our practice at Denim Group. We've found it to be less expensive to turn a developer into a security professional, and I can't really think of situations, maybe some limited situations, where we've turned security professionals and gotten them a high degree of development and knowledge. Great question. Questions about sharing this? Nope. Okay. So do I think that the security champion needs to have development experience, or is that optional? Again, that goes back to the mandate and the roles that you have laid out in your organization. If your security champion, like, in a lot of cases, the answer is probably yes, right? Just the way that we see security champions being used, where they're liaisons for the development team, that experience is really, really valuable, right? For them to be able to speak to the developer in their language. That is, really helpful, especially if you're saying, well, hey, we're trying to speed up remediation. Okay, well, they need to understand how software development works and how bug tracking and IDEs and unit testing and things of that nature. That's really helpful. And so that development background is really helpful and almost required. Although you may look at you may look at a situation and say, hey, for our mandate, we're trying to scale out certain types of pen testing across the teams. Maybe that skill set is not as required. Somebody doesn't need that. But in most cases, the security champions need to have some development background. There's a question if I'm wearing pants. I am wearing pants. Yes. And I don't know if planful is a word, but someone in our organization started using it, and it has really caught on. I like it a lot. So I don't know if planful is a word, but if it's not, it should be. Much like truthy should also be a word. Is this the same T-shirt that I've been wearing for the past 7 days? I might have worn this T-shirt 7 days ago, but I do change my. I do even in quarantine. I do change my shirts. Some questions about, so the challenges with the security champions being effective because they're competing with the security changes they're asking for are, competing with features and functions. So again, going back to Scrum and saying that we're taking story points. So what strategy can be employed to improve visibility, credibility, and value to the security champion that they're not casually prioritized behind a handful of requests? That's a great question. So one of the things that I think is really important is for security representatives to carefully choose their battles. I've seen too many security purists or curmudgeons, depending on which characterization you would like. I've seen too many security curmudgeons take the attitude of, developers are stupid, developers don't care about security, look at all the problems you guys have in the software, and so on and so forth. And so if the security message to the development teams is fix all of this stuff, that's not going to be well received, right? Because there are features, functions, important stuff promised to hotshot VPs that are trying to get their career advanced and things like that. So I think it's important to be able to characterize the risk, right? Is this something that we simply have to do this because of GDPR or PCI or something like that, or let me understand better the risk. And this is an area I think where the security champions have a leg up over the central software security team, because they are, especially if they're people that were drawn from the ranks of the development teams, they, again, can speak the developer's language. They can characterize, hey, here's a pragmatic way to fix this. And they have the, hopefully the trust or the gravitas with that group, for that group to say, hey, we really want to get this feature done, but we understand that if that you're choosing your battles, and if you're choosing to say this is important, that this is going to be, we trust you to represent this in a reasonable way. Let's see. A comment about getting security champions, not just with development teams, but across the company. I think that's really interesting. I spoke with a journalist recently. My view of security champions has been very focused on on development teams. And the journalist asked me a question about, like, well, what do you think about security champions more broadly throughout the organization? And I hadn't thought of that, and I've thought about it a little bit since then, where that is interesting. And I've seen, and an example I have seen is in terms of physical security, where organizations say, hey, if there's a fire alarm, like, you're the person on this team that is responsible for making sure that this area gets cleared out. And so there are probably, in thinking about that, I think there are opportunities to have security champions in other parts of organizations. just to be thinking about those things. Again, I'd need to think about it a little more deeply, but I think it is certainly an idea that has merit. Question: what changes, if anything, if all the champions are in engineering? And again, I think that comes back to a question of what the mandate is for your program. If you're looking to have changes made in the way that your software engineers are developing software, like those folks are going to have those people are going to have the experience and the gravitas and the context to to affect the most change. And so that's typically what we see is that predominantly it's engineers embedded in engineering that are responsible for these security champions rollouts. What is the greatest challenge? What is the greatest challenge users have to fully make use of Threadfix? Thank you, Dan, for that very self-serving question. I mean, I think again, I'll flip that around and talk about the value. One of the things with security champions programs, again, the ability to evaluate what you are doing, right? To say, I took this action, what security outcome change did I see? That is really valuable. And so that's one of the things we've seen organizations use Threadfix for to great effect, to be able to say, we did this with our security champions, this metric went in the right direction, or we did something else with our security champions and that didn't really move the needle as much as we would have expected given the investment that we made. Does it make sense to push certain roles in security to dev and certain to architect for the product team? Yeah, and so that kind of depends. And so with code analysis, I think there are certain things where it makes sense for the code analysis to be done by the dev team. And those are things like CI/CD integration or more of like the linting type of tools. That's where we've seen like, hey, how do we detect the really egregious stuff really early on in the process so that it just gets fixed and it never makes it out into the ecosystem. But if we look at more deep static analysis, using the more complicated tools for that, those are the types of things where you need some level of specialization. Again, that specialization could be developed by a security champion embedded or layered across a couple of teams, or that expertise might exist in a central software security group. But I think it's important to understand like what, if you're trying to get coverage by doing testing in different parts of the organization, what is it reasonable to expect? And similar, if you look at architects, architects are in a good position in a lot of cases with proper training to do threat modeling. So that may be a way to push threat modeling out across the enterprise as opposed to having that be a function of the central software security group. And it really comes down to a question of, do people have the capabilities and does it fit into their workflow, or what aspect of that job fits into their workflow? Comment about security champions with business analysts. Yeah, that's a really good idea. And we've seen that incorporate just a little bit of like abuse case type of work with the business analyst to do a little bit of adversarial thinking at the outset can lead to some really good outcomes. Okay, a question about, is there a way to directly attribute those security improvements back to champions or the team and not the champion, or attributing it to Threadfix? And really, so when I'm looking at Threadfix's role in this, specifically here is, it lets you track metrics across your entire organization, across all the teams you have developing software and all of the applications and all the testing activities and things like that. So it lets you run experiments. You can say, well, we rolled out security champions in these 5 teams, right? Let's look at how, what was the vulnerability prevalence rate before we started that? What was the fix rate? What was the mean time to fix in the remediation? Let's let the champions program run for 3 months and go back and look at those teams again. Did we see that those teams have, again, the experiment is like, what did we change? We incorporated the security champion. Did the security outcomes that team was experiencing change? And so just by having the ability to track those metrics and things like that, that gives you the ability to run those experiments. Is that perfect like it was in a lab? Like, no, but it lets you say, hey, we looked at, we had this team where we did security champions, we had this team where we did security training, we had this team where we did, this team where we did nothing. And you can look to see, hey, what did we do different between these different groups, and how did their outcomes change? And so that's really what we're looking at is, again, from a Threadfix standpoint, Threadfix isn't here to tell you like instructor-led training is awesome and you should do more of it, right? Or it's not here to say this scanner is better than that scanner. What organizations are able to do with Threadfix is to see the data about their program, to potentially run experiments, and then make a determination of this is where I want to allocate my resources. All right, but again, by having that metrics framework in place, you can say here's where we were before, here's where we were after, this is what we did different, and hopefully that puts you in a position inside of your organization to be able to characterize in a much more like fact-based and data-driven manner, what you've been doing in your program and how you've seen with different outcomes. Excellent. Well, that was a lot of questions, great questions. Hopefully my answers were valuable to y'all. One thing I will mention just before we close here is John Dixon is refreshing one of his white papers on security programs and incorporating thoughts on security champions. If you are interested in talking with him about some of the things that you're either doing with security champions or in your program that you think are valuable, or if you're interested in learning more about what he's seen as he's talking to people, please reach out. We're going to be sending an email follow-up after this, and so we'd love for folks to get in touch if they want to relay some of the stories that they've experienced or learn more about some of the things that we've seen. Really appreciate everybody coming out today for another hour of Zoom meeting. Really appreciate you guys spending your time doing that. I hope everybody is staying healthy and safe out there in these kind of scary times. I'm personally thankful that in our industry, we can do a lot of work remote, and so I've been very fortunate. Other people aren't so fortunate, but really appreciate everybody coming out. And everybody stay safe and healthy out there, and take care.